we were no longer effective in having some input in that movie. However, they went forward with it. And of course, if anyone saw it, it was a lengthy movie, and they spent a lot of time on Malcolm's life uh, prior to Islam. And very little was said about his life upon the Shahadatain. And of course, his sister, Ella Collins, may Allah have mercy on her. Um, she passed away in 1996. But her comments on the movie it was that it was symbolism without substance, and it's very difficult to comprehend that if you don't understand what are the principles of Islam and what was the last fulfillment of Malcolm's life as a Muslim. And that was one reason why my father wrote the book, because he was very disappointed that they downplayed Hajj Malik Shabazz Islam. And now here we are, many years later. My father wrote the book in 1992, and we finished this book in 2022. It's been released 2023. And the reason why we came to the front line, his sons and grandsons, to write the second edition, because again, Malcolm is back in the public space, and everyone and anyone is claiming Malcolm, and and a lot of times he's used out of context. And also, we responded to the cry of his wife, the late Betty Shabazz, when she said, "When are the Muslims going to claim Malcolm?" She said, the liberals claim Malcolm, the black nationalist claims Malcolm, but when are the Muslims going to claim Malcolm? So that within itself is a great concern, because we know that a Muslim has rights over another Muslim. And is it upon us to make sure that he's not misunderstood as the dynamic personality he was in the center of the social justice struggle? So we responded to that cry. Now we know that the I call it the Malcolm's Bible, Alex Haley's publication, the autobiography of Malcolm X, as told by Malcolm to Alex. Okay, Alex Haley was a journalist. In fact, he was that was his first major project, is to actually uh, write the autobiography of Malcolm. And the reason why Hajj Malik Shabazz, and I'm going to use these names interchangeably for consistency. When I say Malcolm X, El Hajj Malik Shabazz, we're actually talking about the same person. However, there are some dynamics that we have to look at when we're talking about El Hajj Malik Shabazz, and we'll get into that as well. However, when Malcolm went to Alex Haley and asked him to write the book about his life, he was concerned about uh, propagating the Nation of Islam theology, and he wanted all the proceeds to go in support of that. That was the initial stage of him writing that book, uh, and giving Alex Haley the privilege to do that. But there are many, many books that has been written about his life, articles, video clippings, and all these types of comments. But very few have been written by a Muslim. Very few books have been published by a Muslim. So we wanted the public to be able to see Malcolm through the lens of a Muslim. How do we as Muslims view El Hajj Malik Shabazz? So I say that it is the autobiography of Malcolm X, not told by Malcolm to Alex, but Alex telling the story. Why? Because the book wasn't published until after the assassination of Malcolm. Okay. And also, we know that there were chapters that were left out of the book. That's a concern as well. So we know that Alex Haley was a Republican. He was conservative, and he had opposing views to Malcolm at that particular time. The black nationalism, the Pan Africanism, the separation of races and things like that. So Alex Haley was very, very conservative, and also uh, his recordings of Malcolm life, of course, were shared with law enforcement agencies. So he gave, I mean, by I guess by coercion, by force, that he was able to share that information with them. So they had a minute to minute, intricate insight on Malcolm's life. Now, and I say, and especially for those people who are historians, journalists, people who are actually in the field of da'wah, trying to enlighten people about Islam. And this is my quote: Hajj Malik Shabazz' life is more than just another great American story embellished in historical and literary myth by the pen of authors who have the power to manipulate and reconstruct the narrative for international appeal. So we don't want to make his life a novel, a commodity. We're talking about a real human being. Now, on the back of the book, there's two quotes from our father, and we're going to talk about why he made these quotes later on. And the first quote was, "Where the Muslim world had been silent, we had been outspoken. Where the world had been shocked and confused, we had been steadfast and organized. Where all had succumbed to fear and threat, we affirmed our faith in Allah for the world to witness." Why would my father make that statement? Upon the assassination of Hajj Malik Shabazz, the State Department, in fact, called the Islamic Center, One Riverside Drive, and told the Imam not to get involved. Okay, there were many threats that went out. A lot of people didn't show up, and you can look at the cover of the book, and you only see my father standing there making the takbir, and there's one person that's standing beside him, and we have to ask that question, why? And I asked my father um, years ago when I was a youngster. I asked him, "Who is that person that's standing beside you?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I made takbir, and he came forward." And if you notice, he's not in this picture, but he's actually on the wrong side, praying with my father according to the Sunnah. Mashallah. But he did pray for El Hajj Malik Shabazz. And the second quote on the book is, "History has recorded my participation at the janazah of Hajj Malik, but few in history have recorded or known that we were members of the oldest indigenous Sunni Muslim community in North America, born, raised, and touched by Allah on the soil of the United States." So that's one comment that my father made on that book. Why did he make that comment? We're going to talk about his association with the oldest Islamic Sunni indigenous community in America. Now, what brought my father and El Hajj Malik Shabazz together? You know, a lot of people, and it has even entered into narratives that Hajj Malik Shabazz was able to discover Sunni Islam in Mecca or when he went to Arabia, that he couldn't find Sunni Islam in America. And that is far from the truth. When Hajj Malik Shabazz was exiting the Nation of Islam, he was consulting with other Muslims like Sheikh Dawud Faisal from State Street, Sheikh Imam Shawarbi, the Imam of Islamic Center. My father was a part of that transitional team, but he did it in secret. In the weary hours of the night, he would go and sit with Muslims and so forth and so on. How did my father and Al Hajj Malik Shabazz actually come together? My father was from the Adinu Allahi Universal Arabic Association, Adinu Allahi Jama'iyat Al Arabiyyat Al Ummamiyya. Okay, that organization was chartered by the late Professor Muhammad Izzuddin, Yarhamullah, in 1936 and 1938 in Camden, New Jersey. Now, who is Professor Izzuddin Muhammad? Show of hands. Have anyone heard of him? Show of hands. Raise your hand to heard of Muhammad Izzuddin. Okay. Muhammad Izzuddin established a chartered organization. And when I say charter, today you can go online could fill out an application, and you can get your 501(c), and you can submit your articles of incorporation, your bylaws, and of course, the government give you permission to have a religious organization. But we're talking about the 20s and the 30s. If you had any idea, okay, or any other system, be it religion or political platform or social platform, that did not quote unquote agree with the powers that be, they took you through the litmus test. You had to actually petition back and forth and make sure that all of your articles was consistent. There was no political dissent in that. And alhamdulillah, he was able to get a charter organization. Now, Professor Muhammad Ezzeddin also organized in 1943 what was called the Uniting Islamic Society in Philadelphia. He brought all of the different Islamic groups together, okay, and organized them under the banner of La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. 1943. 1938, he established the Adinullahi Jama'at al-Arabiyyah al-Ummamiyya in Camden, New Jersey, but he started in 1936 in West Valley and Buffalo, New York. Okay? Now, the history of Professor Muhammad Izzuddin goes back to Lomax Bey. Anyone heard of Lomax Bey? Lomax Bey, he was the Grand Governor of the Detroit Temple Number 4 of the Moorish Science Temple. Okay, this goes, but we're back in the 20s now. He was second in charge to Drew Ali, and they were called the Moorish Science Temple of America. Okay, and in 19, and anyone may not be familiar with the Moorish Science Temple, their doctrine, it was a pseudo Eastern type religion or philosophy that attached Islam to it, as an identity. Noble Drew Ali produced what we call the Circle 7, the Quran. It is a compilation of the Aquarian Gospel written by Levi Dowie, and also a Rosicrucian doctrine unto thee I come, and also the Prince Hall Masonic rites and things of that nature. So it was like a conglomeration of that. And it's important, especially, our youth, who are actually navigating in this society. When you look at Muslims, there's a history, there's a backdrop, you see, that we have to articulate, because what happened was there was many pioneers who preceded us, who made the ultimate sacrifice, their wealth, their properties, and many of them gave their lives for Islam. So it's important that we educate ourselves about the early presence of Islam in the New World and who were those personalities that made it happen. Now, Professor Muhammad Izzuddin, known as Lomax Bey, okay, was a de facto from the Moorish Science Temple. When Drew Ali introduced the Circle 7 and proclaimed himself a prophet, Professor Muhammad Izzuddin defected. Okay, and there was a big court case. There was some violence that went on inside of that organization, and so forth and so on. But the thing is, what is the gist of all of this? I'm saying that the Moorish Science Temple, in their very initial stages in the 20s, they were Muslim. Okay, they did not have the basic principles of practice like the arkans, the usuls, and all of these other intricate parts that constitute a full developed Muslim. But they knew from a historical, a nationalistic, and a cultural standpoint that the integrity of those people who came to America by way of the African diaspora was embedded in Islam. In fact, the oldest slave narratives that we read today, I'm talking about African born slaves, not American born Africans. It's the difference. You had those who were born in America, like Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth. They were born here. But you had those like Abdul Rahman Ibrahima. You had Solomon Joe. You had Omar Sayyid. You had Yaramuf Mahmoud. All of these were Muslims, Kelbi. All of these Muslims were born in Africa and they came to the United States as slaves, but they wrote their biographies and their Islamic sciences in the language of Arabic. So the oldest slave narratives that we have are those of Muslims. Okay, and of course, Drew Ali came about in the early 1900s. If you do the math, it was only one generation out of the Emancipation Proclamation where they were born. Even my professor, Muhammad Izzuddin, he was actually one generation away from slavery. They was born one generation after the Emancipation Proclamation. So I'm saying that to say that uh, uh, Noble Drew Ali and Professor Izzuddin actually were in Detroit together. Drew Ali was in Chicago, but Professor Izzuddin was in Detroit, and they established temples. And when he defected from the Moorish Science Temple, he established something called the Mohammedan Church. Why did they use the name church? Because when you actually chartered your organization, the word church and mosque was synonymous. Okay, so it meant not a place where Christians were to perform their worship, but actually a religious institution. They used that term. And after the big dispute, okay, Professor Muhammad Ezzeddin took on the name Ali Bey and he made a migration to Turkey. Why did he go to Turkey? Because Turkey was the seat of the Muslim Caliph. Okay, in 1921 they lost that because they allied with Germany, and definitely they suffered tremendously. Okay, but Professor Muhammad Azzuddin was making a migration to actually the seat of the Caliph, and they went as Muslims. I have all of these. I have all of the newspaper clippings where it says Detroit Negro Muslims hunt for jobs in Turkey, and we also have that those documents in the Turkish newspapers as well. And it says Muslims. It didn't say Moors, which means that they went there and they declared themselves Muslims. So how did Islam in the 20s reach people of color? If anyone heard of the sheikh by the name of Seti Majid, Seti Majid was from Sudan, and he came to America in the 1900s, and he stayed here until 1929. When he went back for a visit, they would not allow him to re-enter into the United States. He was called a Sheikh al-Islam fi America. He was commissioned to come to America and give dawah to the Muslim. And he set up his institutions in Detroit. So that's how Professor Muhammad Izzuddin was able to learn about Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Okay, this is how that happened. And we're talking about in the 1920s. So from that, Professor Muhammad Izzuddin went to Turkey. And again, as I mentioned, they were suffering from a great loss in World War One. So those Muslims, those families who migrated to Turkey could not find stability. So many of them became very disgruntled, very disappointed, and they returned back to wherever. However, Professor Muhammad Izzuddin did not return. He went to Egypt and he studied 5 years at Jamiat al-Azhar. There's two. You have Jamia, the Jamia, which is the university, and you have the Jami, which is the Islamic institution there. If anyone visit Al-Azhar, show of hands, okay, alhamdulillah. If you notice when you go into the courtyard of Al-Azhar, you have these little rooms around, these little classrooms around in the courtyard. They're kind of like semi-active today and more like for tourism. But in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, and even in the 60s, they were very active schools of Islamic learning. You had one classroom you go in, they taught Aqidah. One would teach fiqh. One would teach Quran. One would teach al-Lughat al-Arabiya, so forth and so on. One would teach Sirah. So if you studied there in the courtyards of Al-Azhar, you would acquire an Islamic full-round education. And he was housed by the General Center World Muslim Men Youth. It was a hostel that housed students who wanted to learn Islam. And Seti Majid was one of those people who established that particular institution. So you see the connection. So he was in Egypt in 1930. He studied there for 5 years, and he came back and established the Adino Lahi Universal Arabic Association. That's how that history came to be. And my father, Hajj Heshaam Jaaber, he became the national imam for that organization, which had about 14 units in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, Buffalo, New York, West Valley, Camden, New Jersey. We had it in Hampton, New Jersey, Youngstown, Ohio. It was all over the place. And so as children, much younger than y'all, we used to go to the village during school break and during the summer. And we would study there the Quran. We would study al-Lughat al-Arabiyyah, the Arabic language, the Usul al-Fiqh, Usul al-Din, Sirah of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. I learned to speak Arabic in America, learning from the Adinullahi Jama'at al-Arabiyyah al-Ummiyya. And we did it as children, mashallah. So my father was the the imam. So that's one reason why he was the one who did the janazah for El Hajj Malik Shabazz. And that's the coming together of those two people. Now, the question would be, if all of this was happening in the 30s and 40s and 50s, why is this information not available? Why? We have in our possession 617 declassified files from the FBI. Okay, meaning that this organization was infiltrated, the members were interrogated, there was bribes and threats, and they stopped this growth, they stopped this publicity and exposure. And that's why this information is still somewhat sealed. We are the organic living recipients of that history. Okay, very few know about it. And we have taken the initiative to come forward and make this knowledge known, of course, to Muslims first who came by way of the African diaspora, because you have cultural integrity, you have a legacy inside of that. Possibly many of your ancestors, your great grandparents who came to America by way of the diaspora in shackles, enslaved, perhaps they were Muslims. And of course, we know that at one time, West Africa, 75% of the people there were Muslim. And historians have said that 3 or 4 out of every enslaved person in America was a Muslim. However, and I've read 4,800 pages of the American history books from various publications, and not once, not one time, did they mention any of these slaves who were Muslim, who had actually had a literary biography of their lives. Never did they mention that those people who were in shackles, perhaps 3 or 4 out of every one of the slaves were Muslim. So this is the injustice that has affected our climate and has affected our community. So now when people hear about Islam, they see it as a foreign import, something that is not necessarily organic and natural to the African continent. Subhanallah. So that is why this information has not been disseminated among the people at a mass level. Now, let us go back to El Hajj Malik Shabazz, Malcolm X. And I mentioned, Alex Haley book, and of course, that is Malcolm reinvented himself more than one time. More than one time. So when you're talking about Malcolm, you gotta ask yourself: are you talking about Malcolm Little? Are you talking about Malcolm X? Or are you talking about El Hajj Malik Shabazz? This is critical, and this is critical thinking, because if we just, and Allah knows best, go back 20, 30 years of our lives, we would see that we may not be the same person that we were then. You see? So when someone is talking about Fulani or John Doe or so-and-so, and where he's at today in his development, it may be two different personalities, it may be two different characters. So it's important that we understand that Hajj Malik Shabazz was a transforming human being. Of course, he suffered a very, very tragic life in his early years, growing up. his parents' home was burned to the ground by the Black Legion, a white racist supremacist group. Okay, his father was a Garveyite, and meaning that he was a black nationalist, and of course he represented that. And you can't articulate that now with Black Lives Matter. You have to go back when it was a living experience. Okay, a living experience. His father was allegedly murdered, with his family believed, because he was beaten near death and thrown on a trolley track to be severed, practically half into by the train. And his mother, through stress, deprivation, and poverty, she ended up spending 25 years of her life in a asylum, the Kalamazoo mental asylum. So, of course, Al Hajj Malik Shabazz was a very, and if you compare the injustice, if you compare the oppression and the discrimination that was state sanctioned, then I would say he wasn't angry enough. Okay, to be beaten, to be water hosed, to be what do you call it, segregated. All of these things affected him. Um, I myself, I grew up. Actually, I was born in North Carolina, Jim Crow South. I can recall drinking from water fountains that said colors only. I can recall going to the theater. If anyone here from the South, raise a show of hands. Okay. You got to go back to like the 50s and 60s. I'm 67. If I do Miladi, I'm Hijri, I'm 70 years old according to the Islamic calendar. I'm 70 years old. And I like to say that because Allah has given me that length of time to worship Him on the earth, mashallah. But anyway, so I don't look at the life of Hajj Malik Shabazz and those episodes as history. I look at it as an experience because I too share some of those same sentiments. And again, Malcolm was running from his past. He was running from his pain, and as a result, we know he ended up in prison. He turned to a life of crime and all of the below. And with inside of that, he was a very angry person. In fact, Malcolm was an atheist. He had fallen to the level that he had no sense of reverence for divinity. Could you imagine a human being who actually disconnect himself from divinity in any form? Malcolm was one of those people. Okay. Now, his family had the Garvey philosophy. They were, and Wilford, one of Malcolm's brother. In fact, we were classmates. Me and Wilford, we were classmates in Islamic, uh, the University of Muhammad bin Saud. We were classmates there, and of course, when you have someone from the family who have that direct experience, those conversations can get very interesting. Anyway, so they went to Detroit and Chicago looking for Garvey chapters. Okay, and they visit Malcolm in prison because as they went to Chicago and Detroit, they found out about the Nation of Islam, so they went and they shared it with Malcolm, and of course, that was the perfect platform for him to strike back. You know, now I can say what I need to say. And I have a nation of people behind me who think like I am, or think like I do. So that was a way that he could vent, to come out and to strike. He wasn't that keen on the theology. If you listen to a lot of his speeches, he didn't talk a lot about the theology. He talked about freedom, justice, social justice, human rights violations. He was more like a Pan-Africanist, do for self, these type of things, empowerment of your people. But he didn't talk a lot about the theology because that wasn't really something that motivated him. What motivated him was the fact that he had found self worth in himself, and he was able to reinvent himself. And he came out And we know that he actually, pound for pound, and through his convictions, started the Muhammad Speaks, and he began to build that organization from a few thousand to hundreds of thousands. That was his work. That was his commitment, his dedication. And I think that, inshallah, as Ahlul Sunnah or Jama'ah, we need that motivation. We need that enthusiasm. We need to go on the front line. We need to start confronting the grassroots so that we can make a change in a decadent environment, mashallah. Now, of course, Malcolm was very, very popular. In fact, he was more popular than the founder, Elijah Muhammad. And it began to become a concern among many of the people of the high echelon in that organization, because there was a heavy payroll connected to being a member of the nation if you was actually in the elite category. But Malcolm was serious, and of course, his popularity began to cause some disturbance. And of course, when he made the statement, just a case of chickens coming home to roost upon the assassination of John F. Kennedy. That within itself tantamounted to a big problem. He was silenced. The Nation of Islam put out an apology. They even wrote an article about their mourning for the loss of the American leader, so forth and so on. So this within itself, and again, this was just one reason or one way to actually slow Malcolm down, because Malcolm had become a concern not only for a domestic possibility of a domestic descent, but in his world travels. Okay, identifying with the decolonization of Africa, and countries that was gaining their independence, he was beginning to see a bigger picture. He saw that the problem that the so-called Negro, they use that term then, it's a social classification that they put on people who came by the way of the African diaspora. It didn't apply to anyone but the American grown slave and his descendants. And of course, we have it went from Negro to colored, because the people who had dark skin or who had lighter skin were ashamed of their own appearance because of the humiliation by those who were in power. So they didn't want to be called Negroes, they wanted to be called colors. That was a class status. And from that, they became black. And I'm proud with the 60s, with the movement, then Afro Americans, African American now, and I'm sure 10, 15 years from now, we have another classification. These are all social classification. They're not ethnic, they're not racial. It's a social classification for people who do not know their cultural integrity. To continue our search, we don't need to stop there. Anyway, now when Malcolm defected, not only did Hajj Malik Shabazz defect from the Nation of Islam, also Elijah Muhammad's youngest son, Akbar Muhammad. Anyone familiar with Akbar Muhammad? Show of hands. MashaAllah. Akbar Muhammad he has his PhD in African Studies. He is an Azhar graduate, and he served on the American Fiqh Council for many years in the state. He was very profound in the Islamic sciences. In fact, he was the one that was supposed to take the Nation of Islam to the next level upon the death of Elijah Muhammad. However, when he tried to take that position, he was threatened, and he returned back to Egypt, and he did other things to benefit the Muslims in that manner. And also, Imam Wazi Muhammad, Yarhamullah, he also defected from the Nation of Islam. And Malcolm was in touch with Akbar Muhammad and Imam Wahdi Muhammad. In fact, he asked them to join him. He asked us, let's come together and let's actually establish an Islamic organization. However, in December of 1964, Akbar Muhammad did a press conference in Cairo, Egypt, and he explained his position versus his father's position. This is real history, okay? And it's a long story, so I'm not going to beat you over the head with this today. But there was some defection going on within the very nucleus of the Nation of Islam family, and it's very important to know that Malcolm wasn't the only one that had defected from the Nation of Islam. Okay, he established two organizations. He established the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, and he established the OAAU. That was the Organization for Afro-American Unity. Why did he establish two organizations? One, he wanted to make sure that he kept the Islamic continuum, but at the same time, he did not want to abandon his people, okay, those who were downtrodden, rejected, and oppressed. So he knew that, you know, he had to have some means to reach them. So he continued with the OAAU. And John Henry Clark was one of those founders, and also his sister Ella Collins. Now, of course, Malcolm leaving the Nation of Islam was not a good welcome off. You know, it was conflicting. In fact, he received numerous death threats after leaving the Nation of Islam, many of them, and many people that was ordered to assassinate him when they came into his presence, they joined him. You see how Allah Subhanahu wa Taala, in His mercy, would change the hearts. They have intentions of just we're going to assassinate the minister, and when they get there, they say Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadur Rasulullah. Just like Umar ibn Khattab, radallahu ta'ala anhu, when he saw his sister reading the pages of the Quran, he said, I'm going to kill this man. Subhanallah. And when he went and he met the Prophet ﷺ, and you know the seerah, he said, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu annaka Rasulullah. Subhanallah. So we let Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala do that work. Allah works on the heart. It's our job to work on the minds, mashallah. And of course, Malcolm had ran his course. So he wanted to make the pilgrimage. You know, he wanted to go to the sacred house. And of course, this is one of the arkan, one of the pillars of Islam, to make the Hajj, to visit the house if you have the means, mashallah. But in the 60s, going to Hajj was not as simple as going online, getting a visa, an airline ticket, and you fly to Mecca. No. Because there were many pseudo-Islamic groups in America. So the Hajj courts had to be very particular as to who they would let come inside of Mecca. So in order to go to Mecca, you had to have, if you was coming from a Western country, a non-Islamic country, you had to have a certificate of Shahada, some kind of documentation that said you was a Muslim. And of course, there were designated, authorized institutions that could actually provide you with that. And one of them was the Islamic Center in New York. So Hajj Malik Shabazz, he took his Shahada April 8, 1964. April 8, 1964. Now, and he was assassinated February 21st, 1965. Less than a year on the Shahada. Less than a year. Now, one thing is unique is that when Hajj Malik Shabazz went to Mecca, on his trip to Mecca, when he landed in Jeddah, as you know, those who have made Hajj, show of hands, those who have made the pilgrimage, Takbir, Allahu Akbar. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept your Hajj, mashallah. Amin. He was pulled off the planes by the Ministry of Hajj Police because they knew about Malcolm X in America. They knew about the Nation of Islam in America. And they did have a document in front of them that say, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadur Rasulullah. But they wanted to take him to court to see if, in fact, he truly embraced Islam. So he was taken to the Hajj courts, and Sheikh Ali al-Harkan, who was the judge at that time, who became the Secretary General of the Muslim World League, mashallah, and he took Hajj Malik Shabazz to court. And there, Malcolm, you know, he was very inquisitive, he was very sharp and intelligent. So he aced the test, 110. Okay? But something is unique about that. When Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz established the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, he did not abandon the theology of the Nation of Islam. He still was following that doctrine, black nationalism, The white man was the devil, separation, all of this. That was his doctrine. He just felt that he could operate better with his own autonomy. So Al Hajj Malik Shabazz was all the way in Mecca before he had his epiphany, before the light of Islam entered into his heart. And he said, and I want to read this for you. He said, when he was in Mecca, he said, I had to make a choice. He's in Mecca. I had to make a choice between that and what Elijah Muhammad had been teaching us, which was supposed to be Islam, and accepted Islam. Okay? He said, as a religion, he said, I accepted Islam as a religion that teach brotherhood. And since then, I have not been identified with Elijah Muhammad in any way, shape, or form. Muslims are taught, and we have him saying the kalima shahada in Arabic. When he said, Muslims are taught, La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger or apostle. This is what he said. Now, if you read his letters, there's a very, very unique sentence that stands out when you read his Hajj letters. And one of them, he said, you may be shocked by these words coming from me. But on this pilgrimage, what I have seen and experienced has forced me to rearrange much of my thoughts or much of my thought patterns previously held, and to toss aside some of my previous conclusions. He had made the change right there. This letter came back to James 67X, Abdul Razak. He's the person that you see on the stage when Hajj Malik Shabazz is assassinated with the beard. But at that time, the letter reached him, and he concealed the letter for a week because he was afraid that they had lost their Malcolm. They thought he was going to come back as a black nationalist, a Pan-Africanist, as a separatist, but he came back as a Muslim. And when he made this known, a lot of the people left the Muslim Mosque Incorporated because they didn't want to embrace the disciplines of Islam. A man such as Hajj Malik Shabazz, that profound and dynamic and charismatic, was able to humble himself and submit his will to the will of Allah because he saw within inside of Islam the solution to what? The problems of racism and oppression and discrimination. If white America could accept the religion of Islam, they too could then sincerely accept the oneness of men and cease to measure others always in terms of their difference in color. This is the message that he brought back. Alex Haley stopped short of the Shahada. It takes a Muslim to be able to articulate a Muslim. And this is why we wrote the book, I Buried Malcolm. Now, Malcolm, he said something that was also unique. He said a lot of things that were unique. And as a forensic historian, I try to read that which is unread. I try to find that which was left out of the book, the narrative. And my father always told me to study the author before you read the book. Okay? Because the temperament, the character, the experience, the exposure of an author sometimes influences their writing. They say you can't judge a book by its color, but of course, you can judge this book by its cover. Okay? Now, Malcolm said he said, I believe that I'm the only or the first Negro to make the pilgrimage to Mecca. He said that. And the word Negro today is translated as African American or Afro American or Black American. people of the African diaspora. He wasn't aware, and it shows you how isolated he was from the Muslim world inside of America, the indigenous Muslim, and how well they was able to suppress that information. We have Hajj Hassan of Brooklyn, New York, who made Hajj in 1952. We have Hajj Abdul Rashid, who started the Darul Hikmah in Philadelphia, who made Hajj in 1952. We have Wali Akram, the first mosque of Cleveland, who made Hajj in 1957. My father made Hajj in 1962, and Hajj Muhammad Talib made Hajj in 1964. These are just people that was in our community, you see, but he was unaware that they were people who had already preceded him in making the pilgrimage. A great blessing came from his transition. Malcolm was given scholarships, 21 scholarships, for the people of the Muslim Mosque Incorporated to go and study in Al Azhar. Also, he was given scholarships from the Muslim World League to go study in the University of Medina in Saudi Arabia. And also, he was granted Sheikh Ahmed Hassan as a personal teacher who taught Islam in Mecca for 33 years. He was from Sudan. Okay. Now you notice I keep talking about Sudan, Sudan. Seti Majid was from Sudan. Dus Muhammad Ali was from Sudan. Well, actually, his mother was Sudanese and his father was Egyptian. But at that time, in the 1900s, Sudan and Egypt was one country. Why is it that the Sudani or the Sudanese were privy to people of color in America? Because they could get through the cracks. You see, the anti-messenger nation laws prohibited whites and colors from congregating. And those who came by way of Syria, Turkey, Lebanon, those Muslims who came by the way of the Levant, they were reclassified as whites. So they could not have any interactions with the people of color. But, the Sudanese could come and they could interact. The first recipient of the Malcolm Scholarship was a brother by the name of Sheikh Hajj Ahmed Tawfiq. He was actually started the MIB, the Muslim International Brotherhood, is in Harlem today, and the Imam is Talib Abdul Rashid. Tawfiq was slated to come back and become the Imam of the Muslim Mosque Incorporated. But when he came back, he found it was problematic. Now, Malcolm's teacher and his organization was funded by a person by the name of Muhammad Sarur Sabban. Okay, he was a Saudi nationalist. He was actually a black Arab who was actually the minister of finance. Okay, the minister. I mean, you're talking about economics. Malcolm's. You didn't see this in America, so you saw that kind of status in a person of color was very impactful, very impactful. So just to come down to how Malcolm developed and how my father got involved, I just wanted to kind of like put that out, inshallah. But we know that all good things in our eyes come to an end. We know that February 21st, 1965, some minutes after 3, Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz returned to his Lord. He was assassinated. And on that day, we all died a little bit. Everybody felt the loss. But at the same time, we came a little bit more alive. I don't know if you saw those pictures or actually looked at the people that were in those pictures. One of the primary shots is that when Malcolm is lying on his back, there are 6 people on the stage trying to revive him. 4 are women, 2 are men. 4 are women and 2 are men. And when they interviewed many of those people that were present in the Audubon Ballroom upon that horrific moment, when it was actually a public execution, they were diving for the floor. They were afraid. They were trying to save their own persons. and only one person died that day, and that was Hajj Malik Shabazz. And that's another story. Okay, that's another story. But there was a lady called Yuri Kochiyama. She was a Japanese. She's in the photo. If you look at the photo of them on the stage, she was the only person that was not of color that was a member of the OAAU. She was Japanese, and her family was interred during the Second War when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. They took the Japanese and they put them in camps, and she was one of those victims. And she came out as a political and social activist, and she joined Malcolm X. And in 1975, she took her shahada. You see, she took her shahada, and so that is important. So even Sheikh Ahmed Hassan, the Sudanese brother, was backstage when Malcolm was assassinated. And there's a lot of things going on at that. So, have you ever seen the pictures with Malcolm in the Western suit? And then Hocus Pocus, he's in the Islamic shroud. The one in the Western suit is because Malcolm organization, the OAU and the Muslim Arts Incorporated, were not trained. They weren't trained to properly prepare a Muslim for a janazah. Okay? Because you have to remember that Malcolm, after he took Shahada in 1964, he spent 6 months out of the country. So he had very little contact with the infrastructure of his organization. So they put him in a Western suit, Christian style, and so forth, and had him in state for about 4 days. And of course, the powers that be, law enforcement, State Department, had threatened and warned the Muslims, especially the immigrant Muslims who had no reprisal, do not get involved. It's too political. Not get involved. Okay? And they stepped off. My father made calls and nobody would answer phones. You see? So, and then you see Malcolm in the shroud. Sheikh Ahmed Hassan, he took Malcolm out of the Western suit. He washed him, gave him the ghusl. He scented him, he wrapped him, and he told my father, this is as far as I can go. This is as far as I can go. You have to take it from here. So the Elizabeth, New Jersey, and New York community of Muslims organized to go and to perform the janazah. My mother stood in that congregation and prayed for him. She said, if they're going to harm you, then of course I'm going to have to be there. And it took so many days to find a venue to even bury him, because everyone was closing their doors, because a lot of people wanted to come pay their respects. The Abyssinian Baptist Church was headed by Adam Clayton Powell, who was supposed to be a friend of Malcolm, said, I can't allow the funeral to be conducted here. It's too political. So eventually, Reverend Charles from the Faith Church of God in Christ allowed Malcolm to be prayed over in there by a Muslim, mashallah. And my father came forward and he actually performed the janazah. He had his entourage. They were scattered out inside of the audience in case something went wrong. They were prepared to deal with, the worst case scenario. And he followed Malcolm all the way to the grave, and he did the interment as well. And that person that you see standing in the white garb and all of those pictures, that is the late Hajj Heshaam Jaaber. And 32 years later, when Malcolm's wife was burned, 90% of her body, she summons my father to come to the hospital, because over those 32 years, they had built a relationship. And he used to lead her in the salah, and she used to follow him with her index finger. SubhanAllah. And of course, my brother Imam Ali, he was the one who did the janazah for Malika, the daughter of Hajj Malik Shabazz. So that legacy is still lying dormant. For example, my father is cited in this book. It's called the Kerner Report. Okay, 1968 it was published. It is the 1968 report of the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders. My father was stood between the tanks, flanked with National Guards, and the riders on the other end when Mayor Thomas Dunn of Elizabeth, New Jersey, had given his officers the order, shoot to kill. So my father stood there and he stopped a bloodbath. This book here, The Pictorial History of Black America, okay, and this is the civil rights movement, okay, to a black revolution. And my father is in this book. This is his picture in this book, but they didn't mention his name. You see, because they didn't want Islam to have any credence, any publicity. And of course, they didn't want the society to know that Malcolm had abandoned black nationalism, Pan-Africanism, and he joined at that time 1.3 billion Muslim. And that was just too phenomenon for them to deal with. And that is something that we have to look at today. My father traveled to South Africa when Mandela was in Robben Island. He gave 200 shahada to the Zulu nation, and they built 7 masjids there. He was a part of the legal fund for Amadou Diallo. You know, he was killed in 1999, in New York. He championed Islamic Press International, where he visited over 20 Muslim countries and interviewed heads of states. This legacy is laying dormant. This is a part of our history. El Muslimu Akhu Muslim. The Muslim is the brother of a Muslim, and we have rights over each other. So if anyone is to be an authority on Islam, it has to be a Muslim. A lot of times we see, especially during Malcolm's birthday and Black History Month, we have any and everybody trying to articulate this person, you see, but they stop short of the Shahada. So Alhamdulillah, again, I'd like to thank Masjid Hassan for allowing me to come and to share the information about the new book, I Buried Malcolm. Subhanallah, believe it or not, we actually sold every copy that we had except for 5 copies. 1 second. I tried. We have a right now. It's probably to move it to customs now. We just have another 5,000 copies that's actually going through customs. We was hoping and anticipating that they would be available today or the date before I actually came here. Based on the manifesto, we're supposed to have them last week, but Allah knows best what happened. But of course, you can purchase them online. You can go online and purchase them, and they'll be shipped to you, inshallah. Inshallah. But I don't know. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in control of these affairs, but I apologize for not being able to supply the books today, but I do have the information where you can get them. And also, in closing, for the young people, this is I wrote this book, Color Me Muslim. They are also out of print. They sold out. We're also trying to do a second edition on this. The reason why I wrote this book, I was traveling. I was studying in Egypt some years ago, and I encountered a lot of students from the UK, from America, and so forth and so on. And when we would have conversations at the coffee house and at the mata'im, the restaurants, we would talk about the history of Islam in America. And I would talk about personalities, pioneers, and institutions, and they had no clue what I was talking about. Their perception and understanding that Islam started with the Nation of Islam in 1934. The Sunni Islam came with Malcolm, and the immigrants came over, and they set up their bodegas and so forth, and that's how we get Islam. And I was asked or requested to actually document this history. Brother Muhammad, can you write this down, please, so we can actually have some information about our history? So I took heed to what they said, and I sit down and I began to write, at my desk, And it was ironic that 90% of the information that I was writing, I had some connection to it, some relation to it, ship with it. I knew most of the personalities, and so forth and so on. So I changed the direction of it, and I said, "Well, I'm the best authority of my own life." So I started writing it a biography of my life, an autobiography of my life, Lawani Musliman, Color Me Muslim, and in it, it's like a survival guide. Like I said, I was born in North Carolina, but I grew up in New York, in New Jersey, urban America, and how did I navigate and maintain my Islamic identity in that type of culture at that time? I put some of those elements in this book. Inshallah, when it comes out again, maybe you can find it. You go to ibarrettmalcolm.com. That is the website that carries a lot of our products, inshallah ta'ala. So, Imam, I'm going to pause here. If there's any questions, inshallah, I don't know, you can pull the plug anytime you get ready. But if there's any questions that the audience want to ask me, inshallah, I'll try to answer them briefly, inshallah.
We just have a few more minutes before we can talk.
Nah,
so go ahead and ask questions. And then also Muslim Network TV, they're here, so they also want to talk with you. So,
inshallah ta'ala. Assalamu alaikum. Ahlan. Alhamdulillah bikhair. Alhamdulillah. Great. Yeah, last time we talked, I was in Mecca, right? Yeah, mashallah. Alhamdulillah. Glad to see you, brother. Question? Show of hands. Yes, brother.
So where is Malcolm buried right now?
He's buried in the Firm Cliff Cemetery in Hartsfield, New York.
Hartsfield?
Yeah. Okay. Now, what happened is Hartsdale, Firm Cliff Cemetery, Hartsdale, New York.
Hartsdale.
Yes. Now, because they wouldn't allow them to bury him in Harlem. If they would have buried El Hajj Malik Shabazz in Harlem, they would have literally dug him up. Malcolm was, you see, the smoke is gone now. The atmosphere is clear, but Malcolm was hated for 50 years. They wouldn't even allow his literature in the public libraries and beyond the Mason-Dixon line in Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. No. He's not even really been inaugurated in the civil rights movement. It's still some stigma attached to that because they have to tell the whole story. And if they have to tell the whole story, then they're gonna have to bring people in who actually know the story. So yes, he's in New York. Yes.
So who's responsible for his death?
I always say it's not about who killed Malcolm; it's about why Malcolm was killed and who wanted him dead. That is actually, we have some confessions, we have conspiracies, a lot, but that would be an entire lecture, okay? And definitely, we have some materials coming surrounding that. It's not about who killed Malcolm; it's about why Malcolm was killed and who wanted him dead.
I think you know the answer to this one.
Bismillah. Yes, sister.
My question is, it goes back to the nation, and around the time of Elijah Muhammad, and because when Malcolm Nation speaks about him being killed, so is it to understand that the nation pretty much was like being paid by the government, or they had some kind of influence on them, even though they were calling themselves Muslims and they were saying they hate the white man, different things? Because my whole thing is, how is it that they did not put Malcolm to just tell the real truth about everything?
Yeah, I think you and I are reading the same books. But anyway, I tell you, when you look at, Hajj Malik Shabazz, he was able to preach on the soapbox in Harlem for 10 years. And, and you listen at his language, and how he condemned America, but he was actually supporting segregation. Okay, so knowingly or unknowingly, when you actually fit the what we call the mold, right, or then you are actually given, a pass. Of course, there were some talk about them supporting the white racist supremacist groups, supporting them financially as well. which is a whole nother platform. We wouldn't even get to the questions about the book, but yeah, I think that when they was in the trenches of the NOI, Black nationalism, that supported the segregation agenda, and so the legislation of desegregation in public workplaces, schools, and things like that, actually was actually minimized. And I think that Malcolm's strength in regards to Black nationalism and Pan Africanism supported that agenda. Yes, yes, sir.
How, how old was Malcolm when he got attacked?
Malcolm was 1 year short of his 40th birthday. He was 39. It was actually a month. He and my father was born in the same month. Yes, he was 39. And look at that youth. And he was actually 10 years out there for social justice. And my father was 33 when he did the janazah. So these were shababs. If you look at it in the context of commitment, these were young people that was actually committed for the cause of social justice. Yes. Yes, I have a sister in the back.
Can you explain briefly again the hocus pocus, your words about the suit and then ended up in the shroud?
Meaning that they didn't explain that transition. They just show you one in the suit, and then the one in the shroud with no explanation. Because we know that the way we prepare our dead in Islam is based on a particular fiqh, order, things that has to be done. So if they was to ask the question, why the switch in the clothing, they would have to sit down for an Islamic lesson. So that's why I said hocus pocus. They did not explain why that happened. Yes. Yes, sir.
Alhamdulillah. You've been on this quest for quite some time. I met you many years ago, just as you stated, when we would come for Hajj. You would come and they would introduce us to you, and you would speak to us in terms of much of this history. And one question I have for you: someone today, when I mentioned to them that you're coming, they made the statement that Al Hajj Malik had two burials, and I think now I can see how that conception may have taken place. But actually, were there actually two ceremonies or just one ceremony, but they actually took him out of the suit and then put him in the shroud?
They were actually he didn't have a one burial, but Sheikh Ahmed Hassan that shrouded him, he prayed over him in private. Okay, and then my father prayed. The picture you see is him praying over in public. Now what happened is that the clothing itself, if my in fact that my father had not prayed over him, they would have buried him like a Christian. Okay, they would have closed the coffin and they would have buried him as a Christian. Now there was another person, Ahmed Uthman, from Sudan again. Subhanallah. He's the one that was taking a casual stroll one day, and he heard this man speaking at Temple 7 in Harlem, and he was about 21, 22, and he went upstairs, and lo and behold, it was Malcolm, and he was talking about the topic of the white man being the devil, the blue eyes, and things like this, using this verse in the Quran, etc. And he challenged Malcolm with that, okay? And they became friends over many years. And he actually spoke before Ozzie Davis at the Janazah, okay? He actually talked about Malcolm as a Muslim. And he was afraid because it was impromptu. He hadn't prepared, and Ozzie Davis called him forward to speak. And we have the vocals, his talk, and he's very nervous. And he said, lo and behold, he didn't know what to do. And then my father, Hesham Jaaber, walked in, and that took the burden off him because he knew that someone would have to pray for Hajj Malik Shabazz that day. His rights as a Muslim had to be guaranteed because we know that Salatul Janazah is fard kifaya. It is something that a certain amount of people have to take on the responsibility. But if no one takes on that responsibility, it becomes fard al-ain. It becomes an individual responsibility. And if we do not pray over him, then all of us have sinned. So they were motivated by their belief and conviction in Islam to make sure they carried out the rights of Al Hajj Shabazz, even if it cost them their own lives. Imam, inshallah.
More questions?
Got one more question? Yes, please.
Are you familiar with the documentation that was released based on the autopsy pertaining to his body and how the bullets, based on the Freedom of Information Act, and I looked this up as well. I got an unredacted copy and some other brothers from the Library of Congress. You may be familiar if you are advocate study of history when it comes to law and history together,
Yeah.
not separate. And the autopsy shows that bullets hit his body from like an upward downward position. Dick Gregory also at the time, who was a celebrity / pseudo politician at that particular time. And the reason why I say pseudo because I have my personal reasons based on research. Are you familiar with that, and what's your take on that? Because
Well, I'm familiar with Dick Gregory. I knew Dick Gregory. Dick Gregory used to be a student of my father. We have that information in our library, but it's inconclusive at this point. And I definitely don't want, like I said, I'm forensic in my historian, and when my conclusions are made, I'll look at all the facts. But I'm familiar with the information, but like I said, I can't speak on it with any type of authority today.
well, wasn't asking for surety on it.
Mhm.
I just
Oh yeah, I mean, like I said, the information is there,
yeah.
but like I said, I haven't thoroughly examined it to make a conclusion that I can publicly speak on it.
Okay.
Inshallah. That's the reason. Yes. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Alhamdulillah. We want to thank Alhamdulillah Sheikh Jaaber for coming here today and spend some time with us. And you can always go to iberrymalcolm.com.
ibarrymalcolm.com. Yes.
Yeah, and get the books. I think you have 5 with episodes, so
Yeah.
you'll have to work that out with him, I guess, downstairs.
Also, yeah, downstairs I have a scan as well. Yeah, I'll show them that.
Yeah. Alhamdulillah, thank you for coming out. We appreciate it. Assalamu alaikum.
Alhamdulillah.
Assalamu alaikum.
Salam.
Thank you for coming. And thank you for bringing it.